Okay, good evening everyone. Can I welcome you to tonight's event, Building a Better Politics, with Angela Eagle MP, the Shadow Leader of the House. Can I particularly welcome those of you who were also the hardy souls who were also here at our event last night for the Parliamentary Affairs Lecture, a double header, caused unfortunately by the need to reschedule tonight's event from last week. So if you were at last night's event, it was very good to see you here again. Last week's rescheduling, of course, caused by the events around Baroness Thatcher's funeral, so unavoidable, although in a very apt room in light of those events. Couple of housekeeping matters. Can I ask you, if you haven't already done so, to put your phones on silent? We are audio recording tonight's event, and if you want to Twitter and engage in the conversation online, the hashtag I'm told is #BetterPolitics. So without further ado, if I can introduce our speaker tonight, Angela Eagle. She's been the MP for Wallasey, the Labour MP for Wallasey since 1992. For the last 18 months or so, she's been Shadow Leader of the House, and prior to that, in government for the general election, she held a variety of ministerial posts, particularly at the Treasury and the Department of Work and Pensions. Her speech tonight, Building a Better Politics, I think is timely and challenging. For those of you who keep up with the Hansard Society's Audit of Political Engagement, which we publish every year, you will know that last year we sounded a fairly serious warning about the deterioration in public attitudes to politics across so many areas of political engagement. And therefore, the results last autumn in the Police and Crime Commissioner elections and the mayoral elections really came as no great surprise in terms of turnout. Next month we'll be publishing the 10th report in our series of audits. I won't give the results away today. You'll have to come along to that on the 15th of May, I think it is, the launch date for that report. But suffice to say that while there have been a few improvements here and there are also a number of very, very serious areas of deterioration and worrying trends for the future. So tonight's theme, Building a Better Politics, I think really in essence sums up the mission of the Hansard Society over our 70-year existence since we were founded in 1944. The challenges facing democracy, facing politics, I think are different obviously to 1944, but no less stark and no less challenging. And I believe the problems that our system faces today are as grave as they ever have been, frankly, in the history of the society over that 70-year period, given the deterioration in public attitudes and the state of politics and the fabric of our democracy. And it's why I think the work of the society, in its many varied forms, is as vital as it ever has been. So I'm particularly pleased in that context to welcome Angela to tonight's event, because, and particularly to speak on this theme, because it was in the 1970s that, by her own admission in her maiden speech, as she described it, an enthusiastic 14-year-old schoolgirl, she got to question her first ever Member of Parliament. That MP was Linda Chalker, who she would go on to beat at the 1992 general election. And she asked a question of Linda about the future of the House of Lords, which of course is as virtually unchanged now as it was then. But the event she asked that question at was a Hansard Society event for schools back in the 1970s. So the Society and she have a bit of a history. Any of you wanting to ask a question of her in the future, you never know what might happen in the future. So without further ado, Angela, I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I often wonder when I'm in the constituency and I'm asked questions if history might repeat itself. Anyway, thank you for asking me here, and it's an honour to be hosted by the Hansard Society. As you've just explained, we go back a long way. But you do great service to our democracy. I think both the research and your work engaging people in our democratic structures are vital in an increasingly anti-politics era. In an age where few positively make the case for politics as a vital mechanism for change and renewal, the Hansard Society does just that, and I commend you for it. We meet tonight in the Thatcher room, which is rather disconcerting for any Labour MP, especially someone like me who lived through the bitterness and division of her years in power. And her death has not just prompted memories of the person, but has reignited a debate about her politics. And it's the legacy of Thatcherism that is very much relevant to our topic this evening. There are key turning points in history, moments when it's not just our government that's shifting, but the foundations of our politics shifts as well. One of those turning points was 1945. Britain went into the Second World War governing an empire that ruled half the world. We emerged victorious over fascism, but heavily indebted. And it's a matter of great pride for us as a country, I think, that our reaction to economic turmoil was to create the National Health Service and fight to eradicate what Beveridge called the 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, idleness, and squalor. The post-war settlement was born of that challenge. At a moment of crisis, Britain fundamentally changed for the better. Another turning point was the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, which ended post-war consensus. With her close ally Ronald Reagan, she ensured that market fundamentalism became our dominant ideology. The politics of the welfare state, of the compassionate state, was replaced by the freedom of free market individualism. The political consensus that created then still impacts today, 30 years later. Now, politicians are fond of turning points. They're useful props in speeches like this for a start, but they are also much easier to spot, I think, in retrospect. My contention tonight is that we're now at a turning point of our own. The global banking crisis of 2008 and the depression which followed it have combined with a crisis in our politics to create a volatile and dangerous moment. People are struggling and they don't see a government responding to their plight. We've lost our confidence in an economic system which once delivered rising prosperity but now delivers increasing inequality and insecurity. Instead of politics responding to the crisis, this government's used it to pursue their ideological vision of a minimalist state where people in trouble sink or swim. Their cut and hope for the best approach isn't just undermining our prospects of an economic recovery, it's also suggesting to people that politics is powerless in the face of the demands of the market. And what have we seen to add to this despair? A crisis of trust across all of our major institutions. Parliament, the police, the press, and an ongoing decline in political engagement which the Hansard Society have clocked very well. People are hurting, but they no longer believe that politics is the answer to their problems. And if we're not careful, that will be the epitaph of our time, that people stopped believing that politics could change their lives for the better. So my contention is we've not just got a flatlining economy, but we've got a flatlining democracy too. Thatcherism told a generation that they were in it for themselves. The I was more important than the we. The reach of markets extended to the heart of our communities. Everything became a commodity to be bought and sold. Anything that didn't have a price was regarded as worthless. Commercial exchange was elevated over social interaction. We'd learned the price of everything and the value of nothing. The UK became established as a consumer society with a culture that means that today people think that politics is a service that they can choose to buy into or not. Many don't regard it as a joint endeavour. It's as if they've been told that they're to watch as passive spectators in the stands, and even the audience in the stands is now dwindling. In 1945, experience of war put a premium on working together in a common cause. Wartime spirit meant that everyone felt like a member of the team. They looked out for each other, they believed that as a country they could do anything. And in the words of the famous wartime poster, they believed they could go forward together. Today our governing structures are clearly not delivering, but some are clinging to the failed Thatcherite politics and economics of the 1980s. On the right they argue that we're not being Thatcherite enough, but it was their economic model which crashed so spectacularly in 2008. So we're at a point of change, and it's up to us now to meet the challenge of this new transition. Labour's promise of a one nation Britain's a promise that together we'll build an economy, a society and a new politics for the many, not the few. Now I'm clear that we can't achieve that one nation vision where everyone feels that they have a stake unless we face up to the crisis in our politics as well as our economics. Unless people feel an ownership of their politics, how will they feel ownership of the policies of their government? Which is why this evening I'm announcing a major new inquiry that will explore the problems at the heart of our politics. The People's Politics Inquiry will not be an ordinary inquiry. It won't be made up of the great and the good. It will be made up of disillusioned voters from across the UK who will join us for a conversation about how we can build a better politics. A national inquiry panel made up of these voters will suggest to us how they think we should reform. We'll also explore the outcomes of a conversation with the public in every region and from a process of online submissions where everyone interested in political reform can have their say. Too often, we approach the problem of political reform from the perspective of the political practitioner. But I think that in order to understand why people are disengaged, we should start by talking to the people who are disengaged. So this inquiry is a clear statement of intent from the Labour Party. We're committed to answering the big questions at the heart of our politics. We want to build politics where everyone has a say and where everyone believes that politics is there for them. The inquiry will be a breath of fresh air for a debate on political reform that's all too often about political point scoring or top-down legislative change. So over the course of my speech this evening, I want to set out the areas that the inquiry will explore: our political culture, democratic engagement, and how we can reconnect people with Parliament. I don't seek to provide the answers tonight, and I don't want to preempt the inquiry, but I hope my comments will be taken as the beginning of a debate which is long overdue. I want to start by looking at our political culture today. Cultural questions are always harder to answer, but we have to talk about them if we're to rebuild a better politics. So what do I mean by political culture? I mean all the implicit assumptions which lie behind our political discourse, and I think this can be encompassed in three phrases. You're all the same, nothing ever changes, and you're all in it for yourselves. Now, the greatest privilege for an MP and the biggest strength of our political system, I think, is the opportunity members have to ground themselves in their constituencies, that link, and to talk to their voters. At its best, the constituency link ensures that it's the conversations on doorsteps that inform the conversations in these corridors. When I knock on doors, I ask a simple question: is there anything I can help you with? The initial surprise is always followed with something. My neighbour got burgled and I'm worried about crime. My kid's getting bullied, I'm worried about the local school. The extra, I'm paying for the bedroom tax, I just can't afford it. And I find out what's going on because of that link. When I follow it up with asking who they're going to vote for, I am a politician after all, they often say, oh, I'm not political, or it doesn't make any difference, you're all the same. Well, when I first got interested in politics as a young teenager growing up in the 1970s, I didn't think this way. I had a father in the print trade and a dressmaker mum who told me all the family stories about lack of opportunities for working class people growing up in Sheffield. And I thought this break on opportunity needed to change. And I wanted to help bring about that change, so I joined the Labour Party. It never occurred to me then that all politicians were the same, or that in the words of that well-known anarchist slogan, if voting changed anything, they'd abolish it. Now, David Cameron tells us we're all Thatcherites now, but on the basis of my experience with that slogan, I think it might be more realistic to say we're all anarchists now. It's not just on the doorstep in Wallasey that I hear the phrase, I'm not interested in politics. I hear it everywhere. Paolo Di Canio, the new manager of Sunderland, who's been recently the focus of attention for his alleged fascist sympathies, spoke to the media a few weeks back to try and defend himself. And he said something very revealing. He said, "I don't want to talk about politics because it's not my area." And he went on, "We're not in the Houses of Parliament, we're in a football club." That sentence reveals a lot about how people see our politics today. Where do people think politics resides? In the House of Parliament, detached from them and their lives? Where does politics actually reside? It's everywhere. It's in the football club, it's in the mothers and toddlers group, it's in every part of society. And the other week I was privileged to be able to spend time with some of the Hillsborough families. They suffered unimaginable trauma and then 24 years of cruelty and grave injustice at the hands of what I will call the authorities. Their inspirational campaign, doggedly supported by a whole city, was vindicated this year with the publication of the review of the independent panel, and the new inquests will begin soon. In conversation with them, I was startled to hear the same thing. We're not really into politics, we're not political. Now, how have these inspirational women, who've done something deeply political, successfully taking on an entire establishment and being vindicated, come to think of themselves in this way? People care about their lives and they care about their society, but they don't see that as political. They don't believe that politics is about them. They think it's about big ideas or bits of complex legislation that don't really affect them. So we really need to reconnect politics with people. But the challenge we face in doing this is, I believe, enormous. The Hansard Society's own audit of political engagement says that interest in politics is the lowest it's been since they started the survey. Voter turnout has, on average, been in decline for 50 years, from over 80% in 1958 to 60% in 2010. And turnout in our most recent national elections, the Police and Crime Commissioner elections, was less than 15%. De-alignment is a more pressing concern now than it's ever been, with the number of voters identifying themselves with a political party in decline. Membership of all political parties is estimated to be around just 1% of the UK population. Now, in themselves, these figures are deeply worrying. But think about what this means for an individual, someone in desperate need for something to change, but feeling helpless because they don't think it's possible to affect it. Politics has to understand and answer this pessimism. Because if people don't believe in the transformational power of politics, then either the existing power structures remain unchanged or democracy itself will be threatened. Despite most of the newspaper coverage, which implies the contrary, politics is not a game played out in the Westminster bubble, and it isn't a spectator sport either. But if those who democracy seeks to empower turn away, then politics will decay into all the trivial, personality-driven caricatures that I often hear when I'm out on the doorstep. People may say they're not engaged, but that doesn't mean that they don't engage in political debate or have opinions. They just don't seem to connect them to the formal politics going on day in, day out at Westminster. Too much of it goes completely unreported and virtually unnoticed. It all seems like some esoteric game going on in London which is disconnected to the everyday struggles my constituents, for example, have to grapple with. So our political messages are distilled into sound bites small enough to fit the front page of the Red Tops. Success is repeating the phrase as much as possible. Failure is causing controversy or diluting the message. But if they think about us at all, voters want honesty in debate. They don't want spin. The German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht once said, "Art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it." His observation could, I think, equally apply to democratic politics, though I hope in a gentler way. We can create the society we wish to see. We can tackle the formidable challenges which face us, but only if we work together and forge a new, more inclusive politics which engages, includes and inspires. In the Labour Party, we're taking important steps towards changing our own culture and the way we debate. I chair Labour's National Policy Forum. We've recently transformed how we make policy so that we let go at the top and empower conversations at the grassroots. We've opened up our structures so that members of the public can tell us what they think too through our Your Britain website. We're determined that our next manifesto will be built on real conversations in real communities, informed by real lived experience. Now is the time for us to propose new ideas and debate them. We need to be bold and forward-thinking, not so cautious that we miss the changing tide. And I say this to those who observe us and report the news. Please try to understand and respect our democratic policy-making structures. Please also remember that disagreement doesn't mean disunity. It means that we're comfortable in our identity. We're a united team and we're ready to have a real debate about the ways forward for our country. On Wednesday, the 27th of April 1994, I was driving into the House of Commons with tears streaming down my face as I listened to Archbishop Desmond Tutu interviewed live on the radio, literally singing with joy because he'd finally exercised the right to vote in a free election for the first time in his life after 63 years of waiting. I'm still emotional about it now. Only recently we all watched with bated breath as the Arab Spring toppled demagogues and dictators in the Middle East. Why do we rejoice in the democratic freedoms of others, but seemingly have so little regard for our own? How do we begin to solve the cynicism we see about the power of politics to change lives? How can we rediscover the optimism of the Chartists and the suffragettes? We need a conversation about our culture, and I hope that the People's Politics Inquiry will begin to help us understand what we need to change. The second era of focus for the inquiry will be democratic participation. Elections are at the heart of our democracy, yet voter turnout is falling. And unless we're very careful, individual electoral registration is going to speed up the decline. Voter turnout amongst 18 to 24-year-olds in the last general election was just 44%. And according to the Electoral Commission, over half of our young people aren't even registered to vote. Many don't even know how to vote if they wanted to, and they're too shy to admit that they've never been taught. And there are other astonishing myths about voting, which I have to deal with regularly. I once had to argue with some people in a strongly Labour ward who believed that their non-votes would automatically be counted for Labour. If only, as some of us might think. But when I was first elected Member of Parliament in Wallasey in 1992, the turnout was 80%. In 2010, when I was returned for the fourth time, it was 63.2%. And there were many constituencies with a far worse voter turnout than mine. The Electoral Commission does good work with its voter registration drives, but even before individual voter registration, many millions are disenfranchised and missing from the register. We've neglected our democratic infrastructure. So a few things we might consider. It should be easier for people to vote. Ballot boxes should be where people are, at the supermarket as well as the school. We should consider electronic voting. If we shop online and bank online with the proper security against fraud, then why can't we vote online? We should consider incentives for voting. How about entering everyone who votes into a lottery? What about making election day a bank holiday? Some have suggested compulsory voting, although I'm personally dubious. I welcome the introduction of online registration as part of the move to individual voter registration. We should also consider the case for a national register. Everyone should be taught the mechanics of voting. What was once information handed down informally through family structures must now be available to all. We should do more to embed democratic practice in every aspect of our society, starting in schools. Mock elections should be routine. citizenship education should be protected. Pupils should have hands-on democratic experience in running their own school-based clubs and organisations. DebateMate has already shown that it's possible to encourage pupils to learn the art of debate while still at school. We need new and creative ideas to encourage more people to the ballot box. I hope the inquiry will help us to find solutions that work for people, and I hope you'll also share your ideas with me this evening. Finally, I want to talk about our Parliament, the third focus of the inquiry. Parliament's the fulcrum of our democratic system, and it needs to remain at the heart of our national debate. To deal with the crisis in our politics, we need to make Parliament more relevant and more understood. To that end, I think I'd like to pay tribute to our modernising Speaker. He's built on the work done by Robin Cook when he was Leader of the House, by trying to make Parliament more timely and relevant to the daily news cycle. The increasing frequency of urgent questions is a clear gain, as is his commitment to extending educational outreach programmes to translate our parliamentary rituals to an increasingly bemused public. I believe that too often when we talk about parliamentary reform, our starting point is wrong. Rather than thinking about how Parliament looks to the outsider looking in, we think about our own experience as MPs. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but it shouldn't be our starting point. From that perspective, I think one of the places we should begin is simplifying the legislative process so that the interested citizen can more easily understand and engage with it. The recent extension of scrutinising draft bills is welcome, as are the public reading stages of some bills. But these experiments won't work unless they're accompanied by a far more substantial outreach programme to ensure that awareness of these opportunities reaches beyond the existing NGOs and professional lobbying companies. I think we need to take a hard look at how our scrutiny of legislation works, and I'll be instigating such a discussion in the coming months. Some of the political high points in recent years have come from the work of select committees. They played a vital role in cutting to the heart of some of the scandals which have rocked public confidence, for example on phone hacking. So it's my view that as we move forward, we need to explore whether select committees should be given greater powers. Perhaps the power to scrutinise bills, more time on the floor of the House to debate their reports. I welcome the right reforms of the select committees, but I believe this system of scrutiny of the executive needs strengthening further. More resources would be welcome, but in these straitened times, resource is not easy to come by. My experience as a minister taught me that the civil service really does not understand or appreciate the work of Parliament as much as it should. And I'd like to see far more opportunities for secondments from the civil service to the House service and vice versa. Departments do this with the private sector all the time, and they should certainly do it between the executive and the legislature too. In the 21 years I've been a member of the House, much has changed. Deference has gone, which is good, but it's been replaced by contempt, which is not. I know we'll have to work hard to ensure that the reputation of our Parliament recovers and grows, and I don't have all the answers, but I do know that we need to do more than just tinker around the edges. I think we also need to take action to create a more representative Parliament. When a disengaged member of the public casts an eye towards the chamber, what do they see? A mass of grey suits in a world which looks nothing like their life, speaking a language they rarely understand. I'm just one of 2 out lesbian MPs in the Commons, and I'm one of 146 women in a chamber of 650. We don't have enough of a diversity of backgrounds, classes, or previous employment. The 19th century traditions of the place quite simply aren't conducive to a modern workplace. The working hours challenge family life. The tone of debate is all too often adversarial and off-putting. I was both told to calm down and called dear by our own Prime Minister in one sentence. The model of leadership, it's okay, I'm recovering. The model of leadership thought to be desirable, which is implicit in all the media's political coverage, is brimming with machismo. Political parties are there to be mastered. They're there to be disciplined. As soon as the general election is declared, all female politicians mysteriously disappear from our TV screens. And my colleague John Trickett is doing some important work at the moment in this area, and he's looking at how we can get more working class MPs and more MPs from different backgrounds into our Parliament. I saw the other week that there's a company that's been set up to try and charge people to register them to vote. And I think that says it all about the nature of our politics today. Part of the legacy of Thatcherism is a consumerist politics. The promise of one nation Labour is a contributory politics, where everyone has a stake and everyone is empowered to play their part. We need a new political consensus for a new time. I've always said that if you don't do politics, you get it done to you. We will be on the way to solving the crisis in our politics when we help people to understand and when we empower them to take responsibility and play their part in fixing what is wrong. I'm really looking forward to getting started on the inquiry and continuing the conversation that I've begun this evening. I'd like to thank you very much for listening and look forward to taking your questions and hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Angela. So we will move to questions about People's Politics Inquiry, or more generally about democratic engagement in some of the areas that Angela's talked about in her speech tonight. We have a roving microphone. If you are sat at one of the tables, you're okay. Just use the microphone in front of you. But otherwise, take the microphone. Can I ask, it would be really helpful, particularly for the audio recording, if you could identify yourself and an organisation, if you're representing an organisation or an institution. So I'm going to take them in groups of 3 initially. Who'd like to ask a question? Okay, got a gentleman here, gentleman behind, and then a gentleman here.
It's Councillor Neil Wilson, Executive Member for Equalities and Social Inclusion, London Borough of Newham. We claim to be pretty diverse, beating certain other boroughs, but certainly New York City. Now, it may be slightly easier in the Newham political context to have a representative group like the one I belong to, but going around the streets of Plaistow or West Ham or East Ham, one is struck by the point that you see people engaging with us because we have a diversity, and that's reflected in our political group. So I wanted to start where you finished, Angela, really, about what mechanisms. I mean, obviously it's Newham, so it's the same political party as yourself. But a cross-party point, really, how do we make certain that the perception is one that is engaging both at local level, because obviously I'm biased, I believe that local councils are ignored even more in the national press than Parliament. How do we work together across party to make certain that it is not this sort of, I think you said 19th century sort of, dare I say, independent or public school sort of maintenance. So it's a perception thing as well as the mechanics.
Thank you. And gentleman behind.
So, my name is Max Jarvis. I'm just interested in the practicalities of your report. How do you plan to gauge the interest of the disinterested and the apathetic when, by their very definition, they're not interested? I'm just curious on how you plan to make the report representative.
Hi, I'm Mike Indian from De Havilland. My little sister and I both voted for the first time in 2010, and the day before the election she rang me and she said, "Brother, I hear there's an election on tomorrow. Who do I vote for?" Margaret Hodges said recently that Parliament doesn't sit for long enough, that the public don't perceive MPs as actually doing enough work. Now, Angela, I wanted to ask you, as Shadow Leader of the House, do you feel that such a simple adjustment, simply by shortening the recess, we've had the first Prime Minister's questions for 5 weeks, would be the first step in helping to improve political engagement by convincing the public that their representatives are actually working hard on their behalf? A simple change, but an important first step, perhaps.
Fine. Well, to start with Mike first and the idea that MPs don't do enough work, it's true that we've had our first PMQs for 5 weeks, and we're only going to have 2 more between now and June if you actually look at the way the calendar is working out. I think that's a problem with accountability rather than work. I think it would be helpful if we could get more coverage and more understanding of the work that actually goes on in Parliament. Many people, when you ask them what we do in Parliament, can only think of Prime Minister's questions, because that's the kind of gladiatorial, entertaining thing that happens sometimes once a week, but once a month at the moment. And people have very little understanding of the other work that MPs do. There's a much greater understanding of the work that MPs do in their constituencies, because that's closer to people. And therefore, we've got to think about how we can enable the work that MPs do, particularly in here, to be properly communicated and represented, and people to know what goes on in here apart from that gladiatorial 30 minutes of Prime Minister's questions. In terms of how do we engage the disinterested and not interested, I suspect it's not been done before, because it is quite difficult to get people who are disinterested. But there are various ways we're looking at trying to find them. We're not going to be sort of fixing who they are in advance. But we do know from some of our own voter returns, people, where people are who have voted in the past and have stopped voting. And so we're going to engage in a process to see if we can infuse some of them to come and talk to us about why that is. So a few ideas we've got about how to do that. But certainly we won't be fixing in advance who they are. But they'll have to be people who have fallen off from voting, vote intermittently or something like that.
Or haven't voted before.
Or haven't voted before, clearly. The participation in politics of younger people is a huge issue. And we in the Labour Party, we have policy to reduce the voting age to 16. That's one way to make people, the people who are involved in politics, suddenly take notice of 16-year-olds to give them a vote. But you have to do more than that. So clearly we'll be looking at groups of people who are disenfranchised as well. Young people are an obvious one. So are people from certain minorities. So we'll set out precisely how we've done it and who we've got and how it's worked as part of our report. In terms of Neil's question, obviously it's important that, I think, as someone who's always campaigned for equality, that we try to make our Parliament as representative of our country as possible. And it's been slow, hard progress. When I first got into the House in 1992, there were 60 women out of 650. And I remember walking across the lobby once with about 5 or 6 of us had been out for a meal, and we walked across the lobby together, and quite a lot of the men were very perturbed that a group of us had been seen together, and they thought that we were up to something, because it was so unusual to see more than one woman. So we've come some distance, and we've done that in the Labour Party through quotas and women-only shortlists. I know it's controversial in other areas, but we're committed to it as a party. But you can't just do that. You have to then have outreach to go to people who don't, of their own volition, turn up where you are, and try to get them interested in what you're doing and explain to them why it's important. And I hope that our People's Politics Inquiry will help give me some insight into how we can do this in a deeper way, in a more fundamental way across a range of issues.
Okay, thank you. Next round. Lady at the back there, then the gentleman in the front row, the gentleman in the middle, and then I'll come to the ones on this side in the next round.
Thanks. Jessica Crowe from the Centre for Public Scrutiny. I was interested, as you'd expect, to hear that you were planning to look at how Parliament's scrutiny of legislation and the executive might be improved. And one of the things I think we've observed is that there's a kind of lack of consistency in how select committees operate. Some are brilliant and incisive and forensic. Others, there seems to be quite a lot of grandstanding by some members, more interested in making speeches than asking probing questions. And I wondered if the sort of culture and practice of MPs might form part of what you look at, and if you've got any suggestions for how that might be tackled.
Yeah, my name is Alexander Claxon. Well, I've got a few suggestions in terms of how to engage people in politics, and I would just like to hear your views on whether you agree with them or whether they actually work or not. I mean, I would divide, well, there are obviously many suggestions that you could use, but the two which I would suggest is using education and media to try and engage people. In terms of education, I would suggest that perhaps teaching kids at an earlier age about politics and citizenship and what it means to be a good citizen as part of a society could actually be quite beneficial as they grow older. I mean, some would argue that children would not be interested in politics, but if you teach them mathematics and science, and why not politics and citizenship, then it's sort of a similar point in terms of media. If you look at the channels, there may be like Daily Politics and This Week. Now, someone who's interested in politics will find it quite interesting, but someone who's not would frankly find it quite boring. So why not create certain programs that actually engage people with politics? For example, if you use the example of science, some people say that science is quite boring, but then Brian Cox has managed to create a very engaging program with millions of viewers. So if someone could do the same with politics, then perhaps people would be more interested as well.
Gordon Owen, he might have almost seen what I was going to actually say at the moment, but so I'm not going to cover quite that, because I agree that the civic engagement part at a young age is very important. And I think we've neglected that throughout the history of politics. But moreover, how do we get that over? And I'm mindful that this is a time when we haven't got the resources, because the Children's Parliament, television, where schools can be encouraged through the Education Secretary and through the Shadow Education Secretary, have it in libraries, have it in schools, encourage the schools. Obviously, the juniors of primary schools are not going to want to understand the difference between a green paper and a white paper, so they're engaged at the right levels, and then particularly pitching it as higher. But when we start talking about sixth formers and people going into university, because they are the voters of the future, imminent future, so that they can actually see what's going on. Sometimes it may be filming committee meetings where they're not confidential, where they can understand some of the roles and things that are done in the day-to-day life of Parliament in a light way that actually then makes it something nice to look at and listen to, rather than just hearing the heckles inside Parliament.
I do think, both Gordon and Alex, that we have in the past been far too queasy as a country in teaching politics and citizenship. There are citizenship classes now, and we need to do what we can to improve how they actually equip people to understand the structures of how our democracy works. I've perceived over the years that there's actually been a decline in knowledge. When I first stood for Parliament, people understood the difference between a constituency and a ward in a constituency, and they understood the difference between council elections and general elections. Some still do, but there's been a decline in understanding between what the basic units of democratic participation are. And I think people have been too queasy in this country in the past about teaching politics, because they've caricatured it as if you taught politics, somehow you would be teaching party politics. But you don't have to teach people to be a little Conservative or a little member of the Labour Party if you're teaching them how to participate as citizens in a democratic system. So we should confront that much more head on. And I think, as I said in my speech, that having practical experience of being in a democratic structure, be it to run a club or run at school, is actually really important, because that teaches people how to stand for things and campaign and do all of that, and it can be quite exciting. You don't have to do quite as much door knocking as you do when you stand for Parliament itself. So I agree that we should be thinking of teaching children much earlier about their civic rights and their duties as citizens. The media coverage, what can I say? The media, it's easy to blame them. But I think in many ways a lot of the media coverage forgets to talk about the benefits of democracy. It forgets to put the positive side. and it tends to report personality things or clashes between people rather than enlighten people about what's actually going on and inform. And I think with respect to some of the coverage in the newspapers, it's actively, what it omits sometimes makes it very frustrating because it doesn't help people to understand the wider issues. But I think the general issue there is that because there's no ongoing sort of place where knowledge gets passed around, people have no idea what we're doing when we're in Parliament, although they have a much better understanding. And I think all the IPSA work that they've done on what MPs' pay should be in the next Parliament has demonstrated this. There's a great deal of understanding and empathy and sympathy for what MPs do in the constituency, but almost no understanding whatsoever of what happens in the confines of this building. And I think that that's something we really need to address. Jessica, in terms of the capacity for select committees to scrutinise, I think it's quite important to offer select committees at the beginning of Parliament, perhaps, some skills training on how to question people, some sort of support for the forensic work that they need to do as select committees. I think in terms of scrutinising legislation, we've always used standing committees to do that. So standing committees come together for one bill and then disperse again. So there are arguments for looking at creating, perhaps allowing the select committee structures to look at bills as well. There are a range of things you could do to try and ensure that you gather expertise in a particular place for scrutiny. But I'm also interested in looking to see how we can simplify scrutiny, make it more accessible to those outside who may have an interest in a particular aspect of legislation that's before the House, so that we could have a more immediate dialogue with people when it actually matters.
I think it's just worth reflecting that, particularly after the last year or so, and people like committee chairs like Margaret Hodge that was mentioned earlier, the profile of committees has got much greater press attention, media profile and so on. And certainly one of the results we have pre-released in the next audit is around perceptions of Parliament. And the two indicators where we have seen a change is perceptions of parliaments in terms of holding the effectiveness of Parliament in terms of holding government to account. And certainly the perception through the audit is that, not entirely due to select committees, but it's surely not unrelated to the higher profile of select committees, that they're seen as a more effective element of Parliament's work than they have been for some time. Unfortunately, MPs don't benefit from that because they're seen as somehow separate to the work that you do. You know, satisfaction with MPs doesn't match satisfaction with Parliament as an institution. Right, three more questions. Okay, oh, lots more now. Lady on the front, gentleman behind, and then gentleman right on the back row. You can ask if, given the number, if we can keep them as succinct as possible.
Eve Sampson. I've been struck by the growth of parapolitics, first by campaigning organisations such as those radicals, the National Trust, but now, which I think is more interesting and possibly more threatening for party politics, organisations like Citizens UK, where grassroots organisations come together to mount nationwide campaigns for things which would have been previously seen as party political, and I wondered whether you had any comment on that development.
Okay.
Ollie Benson, among other things, I'm a trustee of the Citizenship Foundation, so very glad to hear your positive things about citizenship education. My question to you is, what do you expect to discover from the inquiry that you don't already know? I'm just thinking there were, previous inquiries like the 2005 Power Inquiry, and things like that. So kind of actually what are you expecting to get out of the inquiry?
Gentleman behind.
My name's Daniel Wood. I'm from the University of Hull. You mentioned about working hours presenting a challenge to family life. I just wondered if you think that the sitting hours should be standardised, and like, what's your opinion on like the late sittings on a Monday?
In terms of other forms of doing politics, I think they've always existed. What worries me at the moment about our political parties is how few people are members of them. I mean, less than 1%. It's absolutely... I mean, gobsmacking is probably the phrase I'd use. That political party membership has sunk so low, but before we beat ourselves up too much, all membership organisations where it's expected that you'll be active have seen a similar kind of fall. There are some membership organisations, the RSPB is always the one that everybody talks about, where they have big active memberships, but they're more associated with leisure and pursuing sort of hobbies than actually sort of being involved in political action until they do their sustainability things and all of that. So I think that this is a general issue in the way our society has developed, and some of it's got to be about our long hours working culture, for example. I think people work many hours now and they can't always, when they get home, think, I know, I'll go and canvass for 2 hours or go to a Labour Party meeting or a meeting of the local Conservative Association or whatever the equivalent is in the Liberal Democrats. I think we ask quite a lot of our activists, but of course the fewer of them there are, the harder it is, and the more work they have to do. So in terms of the developments of new ways of doing campaigning, I don't think we should be threatened by them. I think that we should try to see if we can incorporate them in our own party structures and grow our own party, which is what we've been trying to do in the Labour Party, doing community campaigning. Arnie Graff has been over doing work with us, and we've been trying new ways of community organising in a Labour Party context, which has begun to turn around some of our membership issues in particular areas. Our task is to generalise that throughout the entire country. There are places where the local Labour Party doesn't exactly exist. There are places not too far away from Liverpool where the local Conservative Party doesn't exist. You know, political parties don't have the wide, big base they used to have. And I think that is cultural, but it's also a very, very worrying trend, which inevitably means that it's harder for our political parties really to be in touch with what's going on in their communities. We have to try to reverse it. I'm not saying it'll be easy. In terms of the inquiry results, Ollie, I'm not going to sit here and say what I expect to find out, because I hope I'll find out some unexpected things. I have met many disillusioned voters in my time on the doorstep, but I haven't had enough time to sit down and talk to them in a richer way about why they're disillusioned. You can have doorstep conversations that teach you a certain amount, and I could probably guess. But I want to listen first. So I'm not going to sit here and say that I already know what they're going to tell me. This isn't a process to excuse a view I've got already. It's a genuine attempt to reach out and listen to people who are disillusioned by being involved and have ceased to be involved in politics or think it's relevant to them. I think it changes, but I somehow feel we're quite close to a cliff edge of total indifference that we've got to be really careful about. And so I want to really hear what people have to say. We can compare notes after it's over, and I'll tell you whether I learned anything that was unexpected, but I certainly hope that I will. In terms of working hours, it's an old chestnut for the Parliament, and we are in a situation where I don't think it's ever possible to have a Parliament that has 9 to 5 kind of hours. Something that was a bit more predictable might be good. And there are in Parliament very different views. It's really split down the middle. There are those that really want the hours to go back to the way they were before, so you can have 3 very long days and people can get back to the constituency. There are those that don't want any late nights at all. and we're kind of stuck halfway between. I voted for the reform because I thought it was important to try to make Parliament and its hours more user-friendly for those with young families. But I know that there's controversy on all sides of that.
Okay, 3 more. Lady at the back, gentleman on the bench over the side, and gentleman on the front row.
Emma Ward from the University of Hull. My question is, you spoke of the challenge of engagement with the public and Parliament. Do you think that having Parliament itself open to public visits, like with tours and public galleries, can help this? And also, are there challenges with this, do you think, to having an open Parliament in terms of security, for example?
Okay.
Hi, my name's Steve.
John, sorry. I'll come to you next. Sorry. Bit of clash. Gentleman over there.
My name's Steve. You talked a little bit about leadership. Do you think that people actually need leadership, or do you just need people who can...
Sorry,
you talked about leadership. Do you think we actually need leadership, or do we need proper management, people who can actually make things run properly?
I'm Soon from Ealing Labour. I have a very specific question with regards to political parties and their selection processes. I have some exceptional female friends who wish to stand for elections and wish to go through selections. In particular, the CLP that I'm a member of at the moment have gone for all-women shortlist. But a lot of my female friends are considering not to go for it because they have childcare issues. So what are we doing in terms? What could we do to improve the selection process and make it easier for lone parents and parents with childcare issues?
It's a very Labour Party question. I think in terms of our Parliament being open, it should be open. The German Parliament, when it was rebuilt and reopened in its original site in Berlin, designed by Mr. Rogers, our fantastic architect, makes a big play by having a pathway all the way around the outside. When you get to the top, you can actually see into the chamber of the German Parliament, and that's about openness. I think we should always be open. Our Parliament's not designed in quite the same user-friendly visitor way. I think we called members of the public strangers until only a few years ago, which, you know, is not an ideal use of the word, and it comes from our 19th century origins. I don't think that we should allow issues of security to make it look like our Parliament is not available for people to visit, and that's why it's so important that the central lobby is there, that anyone who happens to be a constituent of mine can come down and see me in central lobby if they give me warning and I'm there, and come and visit me. I think it's a really, really important part of what Parliament does, and I'd like to see far more visitors, far more outreach to schools, not just in the London area. I'd like to see that facilitated in a practical way. Because I remember when I have to say I was already very interested in Parliament from a ridiculously young age, and I organised, along with a certain twin sister of mine, a visit down when we were at school. I think we were about 14, to see our then Conservative Member of Parliament, and it was entrancing to go into the building and be able to walk into the chamber of the House of Commons. It was just, I was very sad. It was very exciting for me as a 14-year-old to be able to do that. And I'd like loads of other people to get the chance to do that and know and understand how special that is, because it's the expression of our decision-making capacity as a nation, the fulcrum of our democratic participation. So, you know, if we get to the stage where people want to do that, then I would be extremely happy, and we mustn't stop them because of security issues. Those can all be dealt with. In terms of leadership, I think that there ought to be different models of leadership rather than this dictatorial model, which is the favoured model in the newspapers amongst those that commentate on politics. And I think that models of leadership are changing in other areas of life, particularly I think the challenge is to change them in companies as well. And I'd just like to see people understanding that there are different models of leadership than acting as a dictator. And actually it's quite a sign of strength if you listen, consult and accept advice rather than just come in and dictate and demand. I just think though that sort of discourse makes it hard for women to fit in to politics. And the more women we can get into politics, the more I hope we'll be able to change that. But that's a process that we're still in the middle of trying to bring about. And that brings me on neatly to the selection processes issue. I mean, I think you make an extremely good point about how difficult it is if someone's got childcare responsibilities to actually take part in a selection process, because as we've widened our selection processes to all member selections, that means that you have to get round more members. And we do our best in the party and the rules and the structures to try to level that playing field, and I'd certainly be interested if you want to let me know from your discussions with your members how we might do things differently so that their participation in an all-women shortlist selection would be facilitated.
Just going back to Sarah's question about visitors, I mean, there's about 1 million people every year visit the house, so there are some real issues around capacity and demand.
Mm.
There are something like 70,000 young people come on school visits.
Yeah, much more now.
Much more in recent years than there ever has been. But there's a real problem about resourcing and capacity, because, I mean, I know the House, we do a lot of work with the education and outreach teams here, and I know the House has even subsidised travel to get young people from schools across the country, not just those sort of within easy reach of London and the South East. And they sell out literally within minutes on the phone. So Parliament could provide endless amounts of visits and so on if the resource was there. But it's a question of, do you resource that, or do you resource the select committees? Do you resource the chamber support and so on? So there's some real challenges. But if you see me afterwards, we've got a very excellent report on that we published last year that I can heartily recommend. Right, three more questions. Gentleman here, because we got confused. Gentleman on the back there, and then the gentleman here.
Thank you. John Young, sorry for getting my cue wrong earlier on. I'd like to inject a little bit of optimism. Compared with 50 years ago, Parliament is surely far more representative of society than it was. I mean, 50 years ago, you had a disproportionate number of minor aristocrats in the Conservative Party and semi-pensioned off trade union officials in the Labour Party. Surely it's better off. However, there must be room for improvement, and I find it incredibly frustrating that despite the fact that every single political party has now given their members the right to vote for their leader, the membership's gone down. So my suggestion, just taking up one of the earlier points, what of the possibility of having open primaries and for selecting candidates, and also what about adopting the Irish voting system so that in any constituency you have at least a choice of Conservative, Labour, whatever. It's not perfect, of course, but if we are going to involve more participation, it will be a start. Okay. Thank you.
My name's Suki Bora. I work for an MP here in the Commons. I wanted to pick up on what you said, Angela, about you being interested in politics from a young age and what you thought about people who want to get involved in politics but weren't necessarily, it touches on what you said, but weren't necessarily engaged from a very young age. I myself wasn't engaged from a young age, and I didn't study politics, but I did end up working here, and it was quite hard for me to make that transition. But what you think could be done for young people who don't come from a voting background, where both their mother and father don't vote, but still are interested in politics, but find it really hard to sort of transition into that role, into that career, so to speak?
My name is Hans Ulrich. Thank you. I have maybe one suggestion why people aren't involved. It's because they might think it doesn't make a difference who is in power. Every democracy seems to experience similar problems these days. And one hears this kind of comment clearly out of Spain, where the demonstrators say whether this party or that party is in power, it doesn't make a difference. Both are corrupt. The quality of policy making isn't good. And and I personally would subscribe to that, and I've made some significant experiences where I thought I should make a contribution and just didn't get a chance. I personally wrote a paper about international development policy. It took me years to write it. I sent it to the select committee of this parliament and the parliament in Germany. I'm German by birth. And actually, neither here nor in Germany, the members of parliament ever inquired about the foundation of the paper. They never said, what you wrote is absolute nonsense, we don't want to discuss it further. They never debated it. I was never given a chance to defend it and suggest a different approach to international development policy. So here, complete lack of engagement. And I wonder why that is. A second example is that a select committee here in the UK examined strategy making in the Cabinet Office about 2 years ago. I think, I'm not sure what the name is of the committee. I attended the meeting. In the course of the meeting, or the meeting came to the conclusion after 1.5 hours that strategy making in the Cabinet Office was motherhood and apple pie quality. And I thought, that is stunning. A country of 60 million people is run by motherhood and apple pie strategy making. How is that possible? I then sent a letter to the Cabinet Office saying, look, they said your strategy making is motherhood and apple pie. It needs to be more professional. I sent them a proposal. Never anybody got back to me. These are just two examples where people don't even take up suggestions on changing systems and approaches and making policy effective. So if people think they don't have an influence, that seems to be clearly the case.
You're still trying though, right? You're still trying.
I'm going to talk to you afterwards.
Oh wow! I can't wait. I mean, but I think, yes, Parliament is more representative now than it used to be, and we are making some progress. I'd like to see much more progress made, personally. In terms of open primaries for selections, the current government said it was going to do this, and it said it was going to allow there to be, I think, in 50 or 100 constituencies open primaries. It's all gone very quiet. It's very expensive to fund open primaries because you essentially have to pay for the entire constituency to have a ballot, and you have to facilitate that, and the money hasn't been forthcoming. I do think we need to open out our selections more, and I think that the argument for opening them out more gets greater the smaller political party membership is. But at the same time, you have to be careful that you don't take away the reason for people getting involved in political parties. One of the things that they do is select candidates to stand for public office. And if you say, well, you know, you're not fit to select candidates to stand for public office, and actually we're going to take that off you and give it to someone else, then why would anyone join a party? So it's not clear, actually, that it's the answer. What it certainly does do, though, as we've seen in the United States, is make the cost of being involved in politics and standing for selection much greater, which tends then to exclude a whole load of people who don't have independent wealth or can't raise money by means that people then often suspect their motives about. And so I would, I think that there are pros and cons in all of that, but I accept your point in terms of trying to get more people involved. In terms of voting systems, I think we've sort of been there with AV, and we can argue about different voting systems and the effect that they have, and probably never agree. I suspect, actually, that we need to have a more fundamental look, and that particular structural change won't make a difference. Voter turnout has gone down in all advanced European democracies, whatever the voting system is. So I think it's something more fundamental than the mechanisms. In terms of young people voting and getting involved in politics, I mean, well done for making your own way through when it wasn't obvious.
Sorry, the point I wanted to raise is not necessarily young people, but someone who may be 23, 24 and someone being 23, 24 and realising that they are interested in politics, but there may be people who have been active in politics for the last, since they were, I mean, I don't know how old you were, but you said you were very young, but let's say 16 at the least.
I was, but I'd been waiting to join the Labour Party for years before then. They wouldn't let me in because I was too young.
Yeah, but if you're 24, say to speak, and you're thinking someone's been active in politics for about 8 years, even just local campaigning, that puts them so far ahead of you. You think, oh well, I'm 8 years behind. How am I going to make that time up? I mean, I think Dr. Sarah Wollaston's a good example where she says she didn't get involved in politics till a lot later on.
I think people have different routes in. I think we need to open up more routes. I think the routes into membership of a political party used to be far more obvious. I've been thinking about this recently. It's about whether people identify with a political party, whether they, in the past, people grew up with an identification that they were expected to vote for a political party because they always did that in the family. I come across people like that all the time. Oh, I'm a Conservative because I've always been, or, you know, my dad would be spinning in his grave if he knew that I was whatever, you know. That's not there anymore, and so those more informal ways into political views have gone. And we need to create new ways in and be as open as possible, which is why we're working in the Labour Party to get back to community organising, to turn back out towards communities and try to say, come and join us. You know, if you want to have an effect and a view and a voice in politics, the best way to do that is actually through membership of a political party. And it's partially my answer as well to Hans's question. It's much harder for particular individuals to have an impact on policy by writing papers if they're doing it as an individual rather than doing it through a political party or an organisation which is plugged into those kinds of things. So, I mean, in the 1970s, when I wanted to change the world, I decided to join the Labour Party. Very few people these days, when they get fired up about a particular issue, think that joining a political party is the way to take it forward. Perhaps it's because of specialisation. There's been specialisation all across advanced economies and democracies, and perhaps people somehow they don't want the compromises that you have to make when you're in a political party, because you get about 40% of what you want and you're left sort of having to support things that you don't want because you're part of a team. If you're in a single issue group, it's much clearer. You can be in favour of that and against everything else. So maybe we just need to think about how that specialisation has worked. But Hans, I think my sort of answer to you would be that you need to do it through a bigger organisation rather than just you as an individual, and you might get a bit more noticed if you can get a bit more activity going around whatever it is that you're seeking to pursue. We're still a sort of collective, politics is a collective thing, and if something comes from an organisation, it's far more likely to be looked at than if it comes from a lone individual.
Okay, time for, I think, one more round. Questions? Anybody else? Yeah. Gentlemen, you've already asked one. I'll come to you in a minute if there's nobody else. There's two there, and there's a gentleman at the back.
Good evening, Angela. I'd like to thank the Hansard Society for this arrangement, and thank you for coming along to give us your time as well. It shouldn't be taken for granted in either case. Just to add a bit of balance, if I may, you attacked the free press, you've attacked Margaret Thatcher, and it appears to be both cases an area of denial. I'm only raising these as a matter of balance for the recording, really. I could mention much more, but I found a lot of what you said in your lecture very controversial in a lot of ways. Well, I won't pursue it, but if you can answer those two, I'd appreciate it. Oh, yeah, I will mention one other thing. You mentioned about local parties. I don't get responses from my local representative at all. In fact, I've now decided that since I don't get responses, I can now consider myself unrepresented. I had no response to that at all. Thanks very much. Thanks all concerned.
Cheers. I've lost track where the other two were. They're here. Okay.
Yeah, my name's Ben Wright. I just wanted it's more of a kind of point to raise rather than a question, really. I think in terms of the inquiry, there needs to kind of be some fairly kind of brave acknowledgement of, as you were talking about, kind of a measure of kind of lack of political engagement, kind of membership of parties, kind of declining identification with parties. I think that has to be kind of an acceptance that maybe they might be right, because in terms of kind of like the major three parties and kind of like the political media and the dominant political debate, there is always a feeling that kind of whether people vote Respect or UKIP or whoever the fourth or third party of the day may be, they're kind of dismissed as kind of being outsiders, and that is the kind of the way they're described politically is to allow people to kind of think that if you don't fit within the kind of main three parties, then somehow you don't kind of belong in the political debate. And I think as you know, the three main political parties have arguably got closer together, it is possibly natural from that there wouldn't be more people who kind of feel like they sit on the outside of that. And I think having that as perhaps something that you examine as the inquiry might be something quite worthwhile.
Yeah, just sort of one bit more practical. So earlier this week, the European Court voted on the UK's ban on political advertising on television. And I think the court divided about 9-8. So it's sort of clearly a debate going on within the court, but it's a debate that we seem very afraid of having in this country. I'm not suggesting that TV political advertisements would be the highest quality of engagement, but it would at least put politics in people's living rooms. I wonder if that's something which you would even sort of look at as a possible way of getting that engagement.
Okay, I mean, I think that's interesting because I think that in our consumer society where the only thing that has a presence is something that's promoted, when democracy isn't promoted except by people like the Hansard Society, and they probably don't have the advertising budget that would be needed to accomplish what you're saying. I think all too often in a more modern society that we're in now, if you don't get promoted like that, you don't really exist and cease to be in the consciousness of a lot of people. I think that some of the things that the Electoral Commission have done with voter registration, which is not party political but is political, might be, sort of a way forwards. This is my personal view, and I'm not dismissing what you're saying, but the difficulty with party political advertising, apart from party political broadcasts, which is allowed on the television, is you get the American scenario, and again what it means is that you get a whole load of attack ads which tend to put people off politics in general. It increases the costs of being involved in politics for any other parties that can't fund themselves with massive amounts of money. And so it tends to be exclusive of entrants and exclusive of people and different types of people rather than inclusive. And I think as a Labour MP I'd want to see an inclusivity rather than an exclusivity, and I'd want to try to counter the effects of big money rather than reinforce the effects of big money. So that would be my sort of comment to you on party political advertising. How I am more interested in what you've said with respect to neutral advertising about how things work. But again, that has to be paid for, and we'd have to think about how to ensure that it was paid for if it was going to be pursued. I'm a democratic politician. I'm a progressive politician. I'm a Labour politician. I believe in democracy. Therefore, I accept that people are right. I always go from the premise that if voter turnout is down, it's not something only about people. It's not that we've got a bad electorate that can't be bothered to vote, go and get me another electorate. We have to listen to why and what they're saying to us, which is what the People's Politics Inquiry is meant to be. It's being designed even as we speak so that we can try to hear that voice and see if there are things that we can do. So my premise on all of these things is, of course, people are right. And in a democracy, the collective view of the electorate, even if individual ones you might disagree with, is usually pretty close to the truth. And, my premise is that I accept it. I'm sorry if you feel I've attacked the free press. I wasn't intending to attack the free press, but I think it's fairly reasonable to have the odd comment about Mrs. Thatcher, since we're in the room that's named after her.
Okay. Right, I think we've time just for one more. If anybody has an outstanding question, gentleman at the back, and then we'll wrap up. Sorry.
My name's Ronnie. I'm the chair of the Rwandese students in the UK. I also run a youth group in North London from underprivileged kids. But I'm new to this country. I just wanted to get an insight from this debate. We recently held a forum on widening participation within politics of this country. And this is what I heard from the youngsters, that politicians, i.e. MPs in this country, it's a very closed club, that you either have to be someone's friend, husband, brother, or very, very close family friend to hack into the establishment, the parliamentary kind of establishment. So because I'm new to this country, I didn't know what was happening. So do you think that puts off lots of people and to kind of come to a conclusion that it's them and we have nothing to do?
I think we should come to your youth group as part of our People's Politics Inquiry. It might be a good thing to do. I mean, as someone who came into politics having nobody in the family who was involved in party politics, being the first person, along with my twin sister, who obviously is the same age, sort of, as me, obviously slightly younger. We were the first people to join the Labour Party in our family. We were the first people to get involved in politics in that way, although our family always voted Labour. That's my history. It never occurred to me that I couldn't get involved in politics or I couldn't get involved in trying to get elected to Parliament. I was a fan of Barbara Castle. When I was growing up, I wanted to be like her in terms of being in the Labour Party and being in Parliament, and she kind of inspired me. And I didn't think about the barriers, but I think now our society, years later, has closed in. It's become more segmented. It's harder for people to move, and perhaps people get too worried about it somehow being a formal career. It's not actually. Politics, if you join a political party and get active and impress people and work from doing all the sort of things that are hardest, it does give you a chance, actually, I think, to get active, involved, elected locally or elected nationally. So I think perhaps we just need to think a bit more about how that can be communicated. I think it may be just a lack of, because political parties are now so small, it may be just a lack of understanding about where they are or how you tie into them or where you would go. We're not always as good in the Labour Party as we might be at replying to people who contact us to join either, by the way. So I think the way that most of our members join is now online, and we must be better at going out and then sort of saying, hi, we're here, you join the Labour Party. Might help. Okay, thank you everyone. I just have one final sort of question stroke plug, really. A theme running through tonight has been
citizenship education, the need to educate young people about politics, the need to provide information about the mechanics of democracy, the influence of the media and so on. The government has agreed to continue with citizenship education in the curriculum, which is a big fear that it would drop out completely, but it is going to be in. And obviously resourcing that is kind of critical, and I think that's an area where there could be cross-party agreement around what that should look like in the interest of all parties. It's not, in a sense, a partisan point. But there's also another, I think, important opportunity coming up, which is party leaders' debates. In terms of not political advertising, but if there are going to be party leaders' debates, a real opportunity for some political education, democratic education around that. At the moment, a lot of the sort of discussion that goes on is very much with the media on one side and the political parties on the other, and the media want it as entertainment. And I think there's a role for education in that. We were involved in the discussions last time, and it was very clear the media weren't interested in an education discussion. It was purely sort of entertainment. So I guess from sort of that angle, looking to the future, not something perhaps for your inquiry, but something to think about in terms of the party's position, whether you might sort of look at that as an opportunity for providing a new platform to engage people more broadly. Okay. I think I'll take that as a yes.
Certainly. Sounds like a good idea.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Can I ask you to join me in thanking Angela for a really broad-ranging speech, an important announcement about the future direction of Labour Party inquiry into these areas, and I think quite an interesting and broad-ranging discussion and Q&A. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Angela. You to look out for our launch of our audit of political engagement in May. You can sign up shortly for that. Otherwise, have a safe journey home, everyone. Thanks.